And
There we go.
you'll handle all the questions as usual, yes?
Yes,
Okay.
right. Okay. All right. Welcome everyone who just joined us. We'll be getting started in about 2 minutes. And so just to let you know, you guys are in the right place. Tonight's speaker is William Hennessy, and the talk is going to be walking along the Hudson. So then we'll be getting started in just a couple minutes. Give me a second. Okay. Right. There we go. Um, Welcome everyone who just joined in. We'll be getting started in about 2 minutes. Tonight's talk is Along the Hudson by William Hennessy, and we'll be getting started soon. I'm going to put in a couple of links on the chat for everyone, just so that we can reference them later. Um, great. Welcome everyone who's just joining us now. We'll be getting started in about a minute, and so just settle in, get ready. Tonight's conversation is going to be about Along the Hudson, a book by William Hennessy, and presentation will be getting started soon. If you can hear ambulances in the background, I'm sorry. There is a little bit of a backup outside my window. All right. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll get started soon. We'll get started now, and then to give you an introduction about tonight's presentation is we'll be having an introduction by Stephanie Azzaroni, and then we'll be doing the presentation section of tonight's presentation, and then afterwards we'll be doing the Q&A. So if you guys have any questions or that you guys want to ask throughout the night, just put them into the chat or put them into the Q&A function that we have, and I'll be answering them throughout after the presentation in a Q&A panel. You'll also be able to ask your own questions, and if anybody here is missing the presentation entirely, or if anyone would like to send this to a friend, we will also be recording it and it'll be live tomorrow morning. Okay, Stephanie, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group's November presentation, Along the Hudson, Walking Manhattan's Western Waterfront. My name is Stephanie Azzarone, and I'm a member of the BNHG Planning Committee. As many of you know by now, the group's goal is to encourage residents of the area to learn more about their neighborhood, Bloomingdale, 96 to 110th Street, Park to Park, and to encourage and facilitate that, the group offers a number of programs from monthly presentations such as these, such as tonight's. And in the recent past, we've had architectural historian Andrew Alpern speak. On December 2nd, we have author John Taranak speaking about his new book, Scoundrels and Scallywags. So there's that. We also offer wonderfully researched and written blogs. We have a terrific quarterly newsletter. We have a very special BNHG collection of files and books. at the Bloomingdale branch of the New York Public Library on 100th Street. In fact, we are looking now to expand that collection of books. So if any of you in the audience have books with that focus on the Bloomingdale neighborhood, and you're interested in donating them to us for the library, please get in touch via the contact form on the website. Also on the website, we have a terrific database of Bloomingdale and neighborhood buildings, as well as access to past presentations. So please take a look. And now on to tonight's presentation. Our speaker, William Hennessy, is an architectural historian and retired art museum director. He is the author of 3 architectural guidebooks: Walking Broadway, 13 Miles of Art and History, Fifth Avenue from Washington Square to Marcus Garvey Park, and his latest, this one, called Along the Hudson, Walking Manhattan's Western Waterfront. Bill, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this very quick walk along about close to 13 miles of beautiful waterfront territory. So to get started, let me share my screen. Okay. And this. There we go, and I think we're ready to go. So you're seeing, of course, the Hudson River straight in front of you, but I thought it might be useful to begin with a little background that most of you probably know already, but it's good to get oriented. So you probably all know that the Hudson rises in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains and descends around 315 miles until it empties into the Atlantic Ocean through New York's harbor. And from the moment it was discovered by Giovanni da Verrazzano in 1524 through Henry Hudson's visit in 1609 until the establishment of New Amsterdam in 1624, the river has been celebrated for its beauty. Think of the Hudson River School painters from Thomas Cole to Frederick Church, or writers like Washington Irving and William Cullen Bryant. But more than anything else, the Hudson has been, from the start, recognized for its commercial potential, as providing both a great natural harbor at its mouth and also an unparalleled gateway northward into the continent's interior. So there are 2 sides of Hudson's personality, the aesthetic and the commercial, and you can experience them both along Manhattan's waterfront. Now, that waterfront is really divided into 2 parts. The commercial development dominates the lower third from the Battery up to 59th Street. And this was along the site of a near unbroken string of busy piers. And then to the north, that yellow line that you see on the screen there, the shoreline has a very different and more bucolic personality. So for this reason, we're going to divide our walk into 2 parts tonight, starting with a quick look at the south before getting to the more beautiful north. So the Hudson has always been, let me back up here, an economic trading corridor. It began with the commerce along the river, began with beaver pelts. That's source, of course, of John Jacob Astor's fortune. But diversification followed very quickly. And the big event in that was this. This is the Erie Canal, the route that linked the Hudson just north of Albany through a series of natural and created waterways all the way to the Great Lakes. Suddenly, timber, grain, minerals, agricultural goods floated down the Hudson for export. And from New York, goods could be sent through Long Island Sound to New England, or down the coast to the south, or across the Atlantic. And there was really no other American port that could match this access to the American heartland. With deep water, ice-free, pretty much year-round, close proximity to the ocean, to the docks, and with this interior access, the port grew quickly. And by 1860, more than half of all America's imports and exports passed through New York City. And in fact, customs duties collected here covered virtually the entire cost of running the nation's government. By the end of World War I, New York was not only America, but the world's largest and busiest port. And as you can see here in this image from around 1930, Manhattan's western waterfront really was a hive of activity from Battery all the way north to 59th Street. But changes were on the way. The first container ship arrived in New York in 1956, and that marked the start of the end of the break bulk cargo that had long sustained the Manhattan waterfront. Ships moved to new terminals across the river, and you see one here in Port Newark and in Port Elizabeth, where the containers could be directly and easily loaded onto rail and truck. And with those containers, and with the arrival of those ports, jobs and vitality left the waterfront. The transatlantic passenger liners, the great superliners of the past, also began to disappear in 1958 when the first non-stop transatlantic jet began service. One by one, those liners disappeared as travelers sought faster and cheaper modes of transportation. Now, all of this took a certain toll on the waterfront, and by 1970, the once vital Hudson piers were reduced to a string of rotting and deserted hulks like the one you see here. The maritime commerce that had changed and moved on left a wasteland behind. Citizens were cut off from the river that was really their city's reason for its existence by miles of blight. This was the New York waterfront that I remember as a kid growing up. So what we're going to do tonight is look at the happy story that unfolded over the next 40 years. But to do that, let's back up again and take a look at the evolution of the commercial part of Manhattan's waterfront in a little bit more detail. So commerce in New York initially developed along the East River. It was a sheltered, a little more closed in set. And that's streets along here, you see, are where those first ships stopped. But a turning point came in 1807 when Robert Fulton launched his steamship, the Clermont. This was the first steam-powered boat, and with a stroke, commercial ships and pleasure craft were no longer dependent on winds and tides. Ships quickly grew larger to handle exploding demand for passengers and freight, and New York's commercial waterfront moved around the tip of Manhattan Island to the more open and spacious Hudson waterfront. Now, unlike other major cities in the world where the development of docks and wharfs was seen as a municipal responsibility, New York took a different path. And they left development on both sides of the island, the East River and the Hudson, to the private sector. Would-be developers could rent or essentially buy land from the city and then develop their own piers on the shore and on what were called water lots. This is essentially land that changed with the tides that was filled in to create hard surface. Lower Manhattan was once covered with lots and lots of hills, and as those hills were leveled, the soil was dumped into the river to create all the area that you see there in yellow on the map that's on the screen now. And then, once having filled in this land, the private developers built their piers out into the river to accommodate the boats. So they had both place for the boat to land and place to build storage and warehousing. Now, they were able to do this because of something called the Montgomery Charter. Back in 1731, this city charter, granted then by the British, gave the city control of the land from the low tide mark all the way out 400 feet into the river. And this is something that we're going to be returning to all along this evening. The spoiled land then was filled, and things were built, piers were built 400 feet out into the river. Something to remember. Well, what happened then? Well, those piers were built. And as you see, the land here was all filled. And these are the piers, beginning with Battery Park. But if this is what the waterfront looked like in the 1940s, this is what that stretch looks like today. Quite a difference. Very little of those old piers remain. In fact, almost none of them do. And this was a result of that change we talked about with the commercial waterfront moving across the river to New Jersey. What grew up in its place is Battery Park City, a remarkable development. The idea came with a proposal from David Rockefeller to revitalize downtown Manhattan. He and his colleagues on the Downtown Manhattan Association felt that there was a danger of commerce moving northward to Midtown, and they wanted to keep it downtown. So the first thing they did was build Chase Manhattan Tower around 1960, the first new building, major office building to rise in Lower Manhattan since the 1930s. The World Trade Center went up next, and to build the World Trade Center, a great deal of additional dirt and spoil were generated. Decision was made to dump this into the river, and suddenly there were 92 acres of new buildable land on the site of those old piers, extending that 400 feet out into the river. So 92 acres of developable land. What was one to do? Well, it took a while to decide, but finally in 1979, the state of New York created what was called the Battery Park City Authority to develop the land. And they hired a firm called Cooper Extra to create an overall plan for that development. Cooper Extra decided to divide the land into 26 separate parcels, each to be individually developed, but under a strict set of guidelines that would create a group of distinct neighborhoods linked by a waterside esplanade and 36 acres of park. In other words, fully 1/3 of this new land was to be given over to parkland. There was to be a variety among the buildings, but there was also to be unity, a variation of scale and density, and a full set of neighborhood resources, stores, entertainment complexes, offices, schools. Well, construction took a while. Began in 1981. Midway along the way came the tragedy of 9/11, and some rebuilding had to be done. Revisions were made to the original plan, and things picked up speed again. So by 2020, Battery Park City was essentially complete. And today it has 50 separate buildings and is home to 14,000 people. Now, Battery Park City is centered on a commercial core, the World Financial Center right at the center. Today it's called Brookfield Place. Carefully grouped set of office towers designed by Cesar Paley that first originally framed the World Trade Center towers and now frame beautifully the Freedom Tower. At ground level, there is a concourse that links all of these buildings. And at the center of it is a winter garden, a kind of galleria inspired by 19th century shopping malls and railway stations that provides a home for gatherings and also for high-end shops. To the north and south of this commercial core are residential buildings, punctuated by parks and by coves along the river that provide stopping points and a place to pause and enjoy what is really a very beautiful set of views of the river. And then linking all of this together, of course, is this 1.5 or nearly 2 mile long esplanade, beautifully landscaped with benches arranged on 2 levels, one for cyclists and one for pedestrians. Now, the esplanade provides a good place for us to stop for a second and take a look across the museum, or across rather the river, to see what lies on the other side. That, of course, is New Jersey. And what you're seeing here is, in fact, Jersey City. And that shoreline was, until fairly recently, occupied by a string of factories, rail yards, and wharves. And it's been transformed over the last couple of decades into a startling new city of office and residential towers. In fact, the old Jersey City is almost unrecognizable, except for one landmark. There's the Jersey City landmark. And then you'll see down here is a reminder of what used to be there. That's the Colgate clock, erected on the site of the great soap factory that once occupied a huge part of that side of the river. Now, the view across the Hudson is a good opportunity for us to remind ourselves of another kind of fundamental fact. And that is that Manhattan's an island. And from a trade point of view, this was initially a great advantage. Islands are self-contained and secure, and they work well when most of the trade that plied the harbor was waterbound. Goods came down the Hudson on boats and then were shipped onward again by boat. But as the port grew and the domestic market increased, railroads began to replace ships for the transport of goods domestically, and also for the transport of passengers. And suddenly, this island location seemed less of a great advantage for Manhattanites. Here's what had to happen. Goods that were arriving by train from the mainland destined for New York City needed to be shipped across the Hudson and on barges. And outgoing goods from Manhattan, or that were arriving on transatlantic ships, need to make that journey in the opposite direction. This led to the creation of huge railroad yards on the New Jersey side that were linked to Manhattan by these fleets of lighters and floats laden with freight cars that tugs pushed back and forth across the river. And at the height of the port, the traffic across the river was truly extraordinary. So take a look at this map, for example. Everything on there that you see in red is a rail yard. And those dotted lines you see represent just a fraction of the number of crossings that were made to get the freight to and from those railway lines that link virtually every major American railroad. And it wasn't just freight that crossed the river. Each of the major railroads that served New York from the west had its own terminal on the New Jersey side of the river, linked to Manhattan by a series of ferry lines. Only two of those terminals remain today. The one at the top is the one that used to serve the Jersey Central Railroad. It's in Jersey City, and it's now a museum, as well as being a place to catch the ferry to the Statue of Liberty. The Erie and Lackawanna terminal in Hoboken remains and is still an important link for thousands of daily commuters who change there either to the path line or to ferries to Manhattan. Now, all of this cross-river traffic, this freight traffic, made the situation even worse when one got across the river to the Manhattan side. There was literally gridlock along West Street at the heads of the piers. And in order to deal with some of this freight traffic, New York Central Railroad brought down a railroad all the way down the west side of Manhattan to deal with freight there. And that railroad ran for a good number of years right down the center of 10th and 11th Avenue, it's a stretch of street that became known as Death Alley. And the railroad even had to go so far as to hire what they called West Side Cowboys, mounted people who ran in front of the trains to shoo people out of the way to protect them. Clearly, the situation was not sustainable, and the city had to come up with a plan. The plan they came up with was this, the West Side Elevated Railroad. It opened in 1934 to carry freight from St. John's Terminal there at the lower right, that's near Houston Street, up on elevated tracks all the way to the large freight yards that are just to the west of what is now Penn Station. The High Line passed along the way through the second story of over 30 buildings, which made it very convenient to load freight onto and off of those freight cars. And the line served well for about 30 years, from 1934 when it opened, as I said, up until the 1960s. By that time, however, the decline of the waterfront and the rise of trucks to carry freight made the line obsolete, and the stretch south of Gansevoort Street was demolished. The remainder of the tracks sat empty and decaying until 1999, when an organization called the Friends of the High Line came into existence to advocate for the conversion of all of these unused trestles into an elevated park. The CSX Railroad, successor of the New York Central, eventually gave the parkland, the potential parkland, to the city. And from 2009 onwards, you could walk from Gansevoort Street north to 20th Street along beautiful landscape paths like this. Today, the High Line, which runs all the way from Gansevoort Street, 1.5 miles north to 34th Street, where it connects directly to Penn Station and to the Hudson Yards development, is one of America's most popular tourist attractions. Now, the High Line was not the only big transportation change to the waterfront during the 1920s and 30s. Because of the boat congestion on the river, those lighters and freight boats going back and forth, plans for a bridge or a tunnel across the Hudson had been discussed over and over again. But there were geographical problems and also security problems that prevented a bridge from being built. Unable to do a bridge, the decision was made to go under the river instead. It took several tries, but in 1927, the engineer Clifford Holland succeeded with the first vehicular tunnel under the Hudson. The tunnel was named the Holland Tunnel in honor of him, its designer. And at the time it was completed, it was the longest such tunnel in the world, an engineering marvel requiring 4 huge ventilation buildings to draw out the stale air inside and keep the tubes inside fresh. The results of the opening of this tunnel were transformational. Suddenly, Manhattan was no longer, in a certain sense, an island. You could drive from New Jersey directly, without getting into your car, right into Manhattan. And as a result of this, suddenly car and truck and tunnel transport in the city rose again. And the congestion in the crowded dock areas became even worse. So the city had to come up with another solution, as they had for the railroad and the High Line. This time, the plan was to build an elevated highway running from the Battery north to 72nd Street, parallel to the docks. The idea was to take through traffic off the streets near the docks and move it swiftly onward. The West Side Highway opened in 1931 as among America's first limited access highways, but there were problems with the design from the first. Among those were maintenance problems, which caused in 1973 a section of the roadway to collapse at Gansevoort Street. There were also design issues. The entrances and exits were on the inside of the road, which made it largely impractical. At any rate, by 1974, the tunnel, or rather the deteriorating highway, was closed to traffic south of 46th Street. Much of it was ultimately demolished, and today it remains only in memory. It seems incredible, but the West Side Highway really was in active service only for 25 years. Well, what to do? The highway was gone. The docks by the 70s were in serious and obvious decline. The neighborhood, as a result, near those docks was becoming increasingly sketchy, and a solution had to be found. The first idea was a so-called Westway idea. This was to be an 8 to 10 lane expressway built on the river, 100 feet to the east of the former pier line. Not surprisingly, fierce opposition grew from neighborhood and city planning groups. So another alternative was proposed, and that was to bury the highway underneath the river in a tunnel. Ultimately, this project too was sunk by environmental issues and also by the evolving public notion of what a waterfront should be all about. And another solution had to be found. The final idea was to replace the highway with a surface highway running from the Battery to 56th Street. This is what is today West Street, and it follows essentially along the lines of the old elevated highway. But as part of the highway deal in 1998, the state of New York designated all of the land to the west of the new highway, which is 4 miles long between Chambers Street and 59th Street, as Hudson River Park. Hudson River Park Act created a trust, a public-private partnership to transform this derelict stretch of the waterfront into an attractive public amenity. And the reports, a quarter of a century later, are there for us to be enjoyed. It's a remarkable achievement, making the banks of the river accessible to the people of the city for the first time as a place to live and relax and play, revitalizing the long, decrepit, and dead waterfront. A number of piers were retained and rebuilt with new uses. This, for example, is Pier 26 at Beach Street. It's a good example. It has restaurants, a sun deck, a playground, an adjacent kayak launching pier. And if you go a little further out, the real focus of the pier is environmental education. There is a river level salt marsh that's been constructed, a science play area focused on marine habitat of the Hudson, and a link to the Billion Oyster Project. And if you look, you can see to the north and south of Pier 26, the remains of a number of other old piers where the pilings were deliberately left in place in the river to provide friendly marine habitat. Now, if one looks to the east of Hudson River Park, one finds that what was once a place for sailors' hotels and brothels and saloons has been transformed into a very tony residential neighborhood. It's the buildings here are the showcase of some of the world's leading starchitects. There are 3 towers on the lower screen there by Richard Meyer, the other works by Herzog and de Meuron, and other buildings nearby by people like Jean Nouvel and Robert Stern. All of them offer stunning river views. But not all of the residential buildings facing the Hudson River Park are new. A number of older industrial buildings have been converted for residential use. Take, for example, West Bath, which was a pioneer in such efforts. This building here is the centerpiece of a 5-building complex that was very long home, first of the Western Electric Company and then of the Bell Telephone Laboratories. First building was went up in 1860, and then between 1896 and 1903, the phone company hired Cyrus Eidlitz to link all the buildings together and to build the block that you see here on your screen. In 1925, manufacturing of telephones and equipment here ceased, and the building became the home to Bell Telephone Laboratories. And it was the spot where the vacuum tube amplifier and the condenser microphone, a system to add sound to motion pictures. It's where LP records were invented and where the first television was tried out. They all got their start here in this building. Well, the labs moved out to New Jersey to get away from the noise and the traffic, leaving the building empty. And in 1966, the National Endowment for Arts and the Jacob Kaplan Foundation stepped in, took over the building, and converted it into 384 apartments and studios for working artists. It still functions in that manner today. The architect of this project was Richard Meyer, whose 3 fancy apartment buildings you saw to the south and there. And this is the interior of West Bath, the first project that he designed in New York City. Now, when we get to Gansevoort Street, the shape and character of the waterfront change. This is the place where the Manhattan street grid kicks in. It's the starting point of today's High Line Park. And it's also a vibrant and trendy neighborhood of shops and restaurants anchored by the Whitney Museum that you see on the screen. The Whitney had its start in Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's studio on 8th Street in 1930, moved to Madison Avenue and 75th Street and stayed there for 30 years. And then out of space, it moved south and relocated to what had been New York's wholesale meat center, the meatpacking district. The museum hired Renzo Piano to design this new home, and the neighborhood was transformed. Here, for example, is what the meatpacking district looked like in its heyday. Trucks bringing in meat that is butchered and then sent out to stores and restaurants. And this is what that same area looks like today. Quite a transformation. Now, just opposite the Whitney Museum and the meatpacking district, the Hudson shoreline undergoes a very significant change. Hudson River Park is interrupted there, and you notice that West Street, which is run straight along the equivalent of 12th Avenue for many blocks, suddenly shifts and swings inland a full block to follow 11th Avenue. And it stays there on 11th Avenue until they come to 24th Street when it swings back westward again. So here it is. Here's the Whitney Museum. Here's West Street on 12th Avenue. It swings in, whoops, and swings back out. Why? Well, if you think back, you remember the Montgomery Charter that I mentioned earlier on. This was the legislation that gave city control of the land under the river for 400 feet out from the low tide mark. It's where all those water lots that were sold to private developers existed. Now, the problem was, as ships kept getting larger, they soon exceeded that length of 400 feet. That was the length of the piers. By 1900, for example, ships like the Titanic were close to 1,000 feet in length. Clearly, something had to be done. And the obvious choice was to extend the piers further into the river for the bigger boats. But the Department of Defense, which controlled the river beyond that 400-foot line, said no. They didn't want the river obstructed. They felt it was a security hazard. So the city's only option was to undo what had been done. So in a huge project, the city purchased back the water lots it had sold to private owners for development and re-watered them. The result is that the outer ends of the pier stayed at the old 400-foot mark, but the eastern end moved about 560 feet back to the east, and West Street moved with it to accommodate it. This gave space for the city's new showplace waterfront, the Chelsea Piers. Construction began in 1902, and instead of a messy hodgepodge of various wooden head buildings put up by different owners, we have a unified and handsome set of head houses in the Beaux-Arts style that stretched all the way from 12th to 22nd Street. The designers here, incidentally, were Warren and Wetmore. You may recognize them as the designers of Grand Central Terminal. The new piers served the Cunard, White Star, Grace, and American lines until even bigger ships came along and made these piers obsolete. Today, the handsome head houses are gone, and most of the Chelsea piers have been redeveloped into an enormous sports complex. But some reminders of their distinguished past still remain. Consider Pier 54. It was here on April 18th in 1912 that the RMS Carpathia docked, bringing to New York the survivors from the Titanic disaster. And it was from this pier that in May of 1915, the ill-fated Lusitania set sail. A lot of history. When Cunard moved further north to longer piers in the 1960s, Pier 54 began to decay, and this is the way it looked for a long time. Today, all that remains of these piers is the steel frame that was once head house. And it stands as a kind of memorial. And if you look very carefully, you can still see the name Kennard written up there. Well, moving further north, the next big thing you come to is this complex. And just to orient you, here you see the end of the Chelsea Piers. Here's West Street swinging back out to follow 12th Avenue again. Now, this area was developed into mammoth freight yards with the construction of the Chelsea Piers. The location of the Chelsea Piers originally served freight lines, and when it was converted to passenger service, those freight lines had to move north. So all of the blocks that you see from about 22nd Street all the way up to close to 42nd Street were long occupied by mammoth rail yards. They connected to piers that were once on the river. That led to building up huge warehouses, like the Start Lehigh building here. And today, mementos of that are present in the Long Island Railway rail yards here that go underneath the Hudson Yards development and lead to Penn Station. A little further north, rail yards have been redeveloped into the Javits Center, New York's great home for conventions. Now, the next stretch of the waterfront, frankly, is pretty boring. So let's jump up to the place where those ocean liners that became too long for the Chelsea Piers landed. This was at a new passenger terminal built by the city between 48th and 54th Street in 1935 to accommodate the largest of the great liners. During its heyday, this was the home of such ships as the Queen Mary and the United States, and particularly the Normandy right here, the greatest of all the liners. Today, those piers are part of the Manhattan cruise ship terminal, and they occasionally see large ships come in, but only two of them serve that purpose. Two more, Piers 92 and 94, have been converted into a venue for trade shows. Moving a little further to the north, we're reaching the end of the commercial waterfront, and you can see a hint of that right here in this very aggressively designed wedge-shaped building, Via 57 West, built 2016. This is the site of Pier 99, the last of the Hudson River. There it is. This marks the place where the commercial waterfront stops and the residential waterfront begins. And it also marks the spot where the West Side Highway that is run on street level, all the way from the Battery north to this point, rises up to become first the DiMaggio Highway and then ultimately the West Side and Henry Hudson Parkway. Now, this area too has changed over the years. The area along the shore from 57th to 72nd Street was long occupied by the enormous so-called 60th Street rail yard, a vast complex of sidings and piers and float bridges. There's even a locomotive roundhouse that you can see here in this photograph. But as traffic dropped at the rail yard, found it had less boxcars to deal with. And in the 1970s, developed or saw a huge opportunity here, a parallel to that had been offered actually on the landfill that became Battery Park City. So the rail yard was closed, and like Battery Park City, a number of proposals were floated for its development. There were competing plans, financial problems. Donald Trump got involved at some point and particularly got forced to back out. But finally, in 1997, things got moving on the creation of yet another new residential neighborhood and of a new park on the site of the old rail yard. That development is Riverside South. 11 buildings that went up between 1998 and 2008, arranged along a new street called Riverside Boulevard on a rise overlooking the river. The surviving railway tracks that today carry Amtrak's Empire service in and out of Penn Station were buried in a tunnel. But plans to bury the highway in the same way came to naught. And in the end, the old elevated highway was simply rebuilt on the trestle here and runs essentially outside the front doors of the new apartment towers. Down beneath the highway, the old freight yards themselves became the site of the new 24-acre Riverside Park South. Now, park design combines very attractive walkways, seating areas, groves of trees, plantings of marsh grass. But the designer, whose name is Thomas Balsley, enthusiastically embraced the railroad history of the area. He didn't want people to forget what had been there. So he laid walkways in lines that parallel the old track lines. And he provided benches that are labeled with the logos of the railways that once sent freight here. And he even reconstructed some of the old docking piers that stretched out into the river. But best of all, he made the decision to preserve this float bridge. This is the last remaining of these. There are lots of them once dotted the Hudson shore. And in the early 20th century, 3,000 to 5,000 freight cars made that river crossing between Manhattan and New Jersey every day. And these bridges enabled that to happen. Freight cars could be quickly loaded from shore onto these bridges, and from there onto the lighters and barges that would carry them across the river. They were state-of-the-art machinery in their day and are today a fabulous reminder of the history of the neighborhood. Then at 72nd Street, Riverside Park South gives way to Riverside Park itself. And this is the way that that neighborhood looked around 1920. You can see down below there, their haphazard collection of construction sheds and lumber yards along the river and a couple of small piers. You'll notice that the railroad actually was 6 full tracks of that part. And then to the east of that, a narrow, somewhat barren stretch of Riverside Park. And then at the top of the rise, the graceful curve of Riverside Drive and the mansions and apartment buildings that lined it. Now, this layout was the work of Frederick Law Olmsted, the well-known designer of Central Park. And in 1875, he had been commissioned by the city to do for the West Side what he had done for the center of Manhattan, to lay out both a new park and a flanking boulevard. But as we see, Olmsted's design was problematic. The boulevard was lovely, but the park was narrow and underdeveloped. And the railway and the riverbank itself were both unappealing and inaccessible. I mean, steam trains passed along here as late as 1923. Things changed dramatically in 1934, when then Parks Commissioner Robert Moses stepped in. Using funds from the WPA, he re-envisioned and completely redesigned the park. All the old wharfs and industrial sites along the river were removed, and the park was extended to the river's end. And about 100 acres of landfill were in fact added for more plantings and for recreational facilities. The railway was covered over to run beneath a broad promenade at the center of the park, and playgrounds, ball fields, and other amenities were added amidst the meandering paths and careful plantings. The park really became dramatically more appealing. Only one problem. Moses loved highways, and he pushed an extension of the West Side Highway northward through the park with the goal of linking up to additional highways leading north through the Bronx. And this, of course, is today Henry Hudson Parkway. Somewhat ironic that on one hand, Moses reclaimed the riverbank for the people and got rid of the railway that had been a barrier to river access. And no sooner had he done that, then he proceeded to reblock that access with a highway. Now, the highway is actually not all that unattractive, and it has one great architectural feature, the so-called rotunda. This is the central architectural feature of Riverside Park, in fact. And it's a wonderful geometric puzzle. Provides access to the west side, or to the Henry Hudson Parkway from 79th Street. You can get on and off in both directions. You can go underneath the parkway to reach this rotunda that leads down to past a fountain to an underground parking garage, and to a set of terraces that end in a seasonal restaurant and to a marina. It's a great work of 20th century design. This photograph also lets you see here the esplanade that hides the Underground Railroad tracks that in fact also pass under the rotunda on its way north. Now today, long, thin Riverside Park is much loved, heavily resourced, used by everyone on the upper west side. Now up above the park is the wonderful undulating curve of Riverside Drive that remains one of Manhattan's most handsome and appealing street. One that a lot of its appeal comes from the fact that it defies the rigid street grid that characterizes most of the rest of Manhattan. Now, the hopes were that this boulevard would rival Fifth Avenue as New York's most fashionable address. That didn't fully pan out, but the drive is still home to some remarkable houses. A good number of them were erected by an eccentric but visionary designer and architect named Clarence True. In 1896, he purchased all the land on Riverside Drive south of 84th Street, from 72nd to 84th, in other words. He hired a group of architects, including a fellow named Charles Bouet, to design mansions that would go along that stretch. And you see a stretch of them here at the bottom. And here is the drawing that Bouet did to show what Mr. True really would have liked that whole stretch to look like. The houses are interesting because they are not cookie cutter tenement designs at all. Each one has a different dynamic street plan, or rather floor plan. Some of them are arranged to go deep into the block, others stretch around corners. And one of the things that almost all of them have is a corner tower. The architect and Mr. True loved towers, and this is my favorite because it shows how that love of towers can actually get a guy in trouble. This is at 103 to 109 Riverside, and the building once had a fully round tower. You can see hint of that right here. You'll notice today it's flat on the Riverside Drive side. That was because in 1911, the people who lived down the block said, you know, your tower goes over the property line onto what is public territory. A lawsuit resulted, and in 1911, the solution was reached to simply shear off the round part of that tower to make it conform to the street line. Now, these are by New York standards, mansion standards, modest houses. The Isaac Rice House, so-called Villa Julia, at 89th Street, designed in 1901 by the theatrical architects Hertz and Talent. They built the Lyceum and New Amsterdam theaters down by 42nd Street. Is not understated at all. It's a wonderful blend of architectural styles. Dark red brick set off by bold marble trim. In fact, the whole facade facing the river is a kind of serliana, an expansion of what's usually used only for windows. There's a high central arch flanked by lower things on either side. The north side of the house that you see on the right-hand screen provides access to the ground floor through a porte-cochere, and has wonderfully substantial segmented arches. And in the center is a charming relief that shows 6 children who may or may not have been members of the Rice family, holding emblems indicating the liberal arts. Mr. Rice and his wife were both born in Bavaria. He was an author, a lawyer, and an early proponent of electric vehicles ahead of his time. And Mrs. Rice was a physician who made her avocation pressing for laws to limit street noise and also the noise of tugboats and other vehicles on the river. The Rices sold their house in 1907 to a man named Solomon Skenazy, who was a tobacco importer who lived there for the remainder of his life. And we'll see his brother Morris's house further along at 351 Riverside Drive. And there it is. These two houses are the only remainders of about 30 freestanding houses that once appeared along Riverside Drive. These are the only two freestanding ones remaining. And it's interesting that they belonged at some time to the same family. Morris and Laurette Skenazy hired the architect William Tuthill to build their house. Mr. Tuthill's best known work is Carnegie Hall. And here, instead of a sort of Italian villa style, Morris chose to take his inspiration from the French Renaissance. So we have a kind of mini chateau in gleaming white marble with a striking green tile roof and wonderfully elaborate dormers with quite spirited detail. Building has a kind of cool, self-contained quality about it that's reinforced by the fact that it's essentially surrounded by a moat. And I understand that so proud was Mr. Skenazy of the gleaming white marble building that he built in special systems that enabled it to be washed and maintain its cleanliness. A little further north, at 337 Riverside, is another notable house. This is River Mansion, currently actually on the market. A red brick building, quite an imposing building with again, limestone trim and a high mansard roof with projecting bays. To me, the nicest thing about this building, however, is the very imposing entry, flanked by banded columns and hunkering down along a heavy portico that is labeled with the name River House in the cartouche over the entrance. One block south, another great mansion, is 330 Riverside on 105th Street, built in 1901 by the architectural firm of Janes and Leo. The building was fascinatingly built on speculation. This is part of the grand hopes for Riverside Drive. And indeed, it found a buyer, a man named Robert Benson Davis, who is the head of the Davis Baking Powder Company. Today, this more urban Parisian building is the home of the Catholic organization Opus Dei. Now, the block to the north, between the Davis House and River Mansion, here, is also a fascinating one. For example, take this building here, the 311. This is once a twin. It had two houses standing next to each other, but that was demolished in 1963 to make way for a new home for the American Buddhist Studies Center. And the Buddhist Studies Center put up this statue of the Buddhist monk Shinran Shonin that had been created in the 1930s and somehow had survived the Hiroshima attack. It was installed here in 1955. This building was best known, 331 rather, the standing building was best known as the home that William Randolph Hearst purchased for his girlfriend, Marion Davis. I might mention Duke Ellington lived on the block, a couple of doors down for a time. And the block has lots of other stories connected with it. And if you want to learn them, I'd recommend a wonderful book called The Man with the Sawed-Off Leg by Daniel Watkins that is devoted to a history of this block by itself. But returning to William Randolph Hearst, he provides a wonderful introduction to the other great building type along Riverside Drive, and that is the distinguished apartment houses. This is the Clarendon at the corner of 86th Street. Went up in 1906, and it may not be the most architecturally distinguished of the great buildings along Riverside Drive, but it has an interesting history nonetheless. William Randolph Hearst, moved in here in 1908, 2 years after the building was finished, and converted the top floors into a single room apartment, 30-room apartment. Sorry, 3 floors, 30 rooms. Wasn't enough though. Hearst soon outgrew this and asked the building's owners if they might give him permission to build a 100-foot long vaulted tapestry gallery on the roof. The building owner said no, at which point Hearst bought the building and went right ahead and built his tapestry gallery, as well as the wonderful library that you see below. The apartment, of course, was later subdivided, but you can still see the remains of that tapestry gallery up on the roof. Of course, another great Riverside Drive apartment. This is the Normandy at 86th Street, put up in 1938 to designs by the great architect Emery Roth, who I recently heard of from my friend Mr. Alford. Now you might know Emery Roth mostly for his buildings along Central Park West, but I'll show you those. Yeah, we'll show these two. You see the kinship right here between the Beresford there at the bottom and the San Remo at the top. Clearly, the Normandy is cut from the same cloth, but there's some differences. The stylistic kind of schizophrenia of the Normandy is one of the things that makes it interesting. It's clearly a contemporary building. It has wonderful rounded windows that turn the corners. It has fantastic Art Deco detailing and other quite clearly modern touches. But at the same time, if you look up at the top, it has a lot of Italian Renaissance. There's elements as well. There Italian peak roof towers there. There are edicula and cornices, and down below at street level, there are Italian urns as well. So there's a kind of a nice mixture of styles. There you are. Now the master apartments, just 2 years or 10 years before, in 1928 by Harvey Wiley Corbett, it is much less uncompromising in its style. One of the great Art Deco towers of New York City. The building was commissioned by a financier by the name of Louis Horst, and his idea was that it would be a kind of center for art education, as well as the New York base for the Russian artist and theosophist Nicholas Roerch, of whom Horst was a patron. The building he built has 390 small apartments designed specifically for artists. And on the lower floors, he located what he called the Master Institute. It included a 300-seat theater, an art library, art studios, as well as a museum specifically dedicated to Nicholas Roerch's work. Together, Roerch and Horst saw this as a place where artistic practice and spirituality and daily life could all come together. Building is a wonderful design. It rises from the street, and as it rises, the color of the brick changes. It's set back on all 4 sides to ensure that no one is denied a view, and it's topped by this extraordinary and distinctive cupola. It was also the first building in New York to feature these wraparound corner windows that provide rooms with simultaneous illumination from 2 directions. It also has some truly great Art Deco detailing. Look at the trouble that Corbett has gone to design the window security grills, and look at the way the original entrance to what became the Riverside Museum, the way he uses brickwork here in different patterns to create a wonderfully lively effect. The building is a twin almost to the other great apartment skyscraper Art Deco tower, the corporate design. This is 1 Fifth Avenue down, just facing onto Washington Square Park. And it also was an influential building in that if you look at the building that is immediately to the north of it here, you'll see that the designer of that structure paid very, very close attention to what Corbett had done in his wonderful tower. Might say that this partnership between Horsch and the Wright didn't last. In 1932, they had a split, and Horsch took full control of the building. He managed to keep the Master Institute going as the Riverside Museum up until 1971. And Mr. Rourke moved around the corner to a new building where he has his own museum out on 107th Street that continues today. Here's one of my favorite buildings along this stretch of Riverside Drive. This is the Cliff Dwelling. Went up in 1914 at the corner of 96th Street. The developer here, his name was Leslie Palmer, had initially planned to acquire a good deal of land to build a much larger building. He, however, was unable to do so. But undeterred, he went ahead and built on the narrow, irregular lot that he was able to acquire. And you can see that here, that the building is almost like the Flatiron Building downtown. Result is that the northern tip of the building is only 9 feet wide. So you can imagine what the shape of the apartments inside were originally like. There you can see that 9-foot end. The building went co-op in 1979, and many of the apartments were combined. It was at that point that kitchens were installed because the original building was designed as an apartment hotel by the architect Herman Lee Meter. Mr. Meter was a character in himself. He lived for a time in the old Waldorf Hotel, where he was famous both for his lavish parties and also for his absolute passion for all things having to do with Mexico. He loved Aztec, Mayan, and Native American motifs and plastered them all over the Cliff Dwelling. Let's move a little further north to yet another great apartment building. This is the Hendrick Hudson at 380 Riverside Drive, went up in 1907. A truly ambitious building. It, at the time of its completion, was the largest apartment house in New York. And it was designed to take full advantage of both park and river views. Notice the rhythmically placed balconies, with stone and bronze trim. It had a Spanish tile roof, rich sculptural decoration, very much designed to impress, all the way up to the rooftop pergola with its twin towers and its little sun deck in between. Inside, there was a billiard parlor, barbershop, hairdresser, latest bathroom fittings, everything that could be designed. Now, this was, however, not a building for the super rich. The apartments, for a 4-bedroom apartment only had 1 servant's room, so it was quite downscale. But an impressive building, nonetheless, that got off to a great start. Alas, today, the building is not in great shape. It's a co-op, and it's a kind of architectural shadow of its former self. You notice the rooftop pergola and one of the towers has been removed. The balconies have largely been stripped off, a good deal of the detailing gone. But one thing that does remain is the building's glorious entry portal, inspired by that of the City Hall in Toulon, France. Well, Riverside Drive is a center not just for great houses and great apartment buildings, but also it's a street of monuments. Seems like every couple of blocks along the drive, there's a memorial of some sort overlooking the river. And they run from the Soldiers and Sailors Monument here. It was completed in 1902 and happily is about to get a restoration, to the New York Firemen's Memorial here, beautifully set on a plaza, and to the monument to Joan of Arc. created by Anna Huntington and dedicated in 1915. The statue designed by a woman sculptor, an American woman sculptor, honoring a great heroine, Rose, who liberated France from foreign domination, Rose in the midst of the First World War, and seemed very timely at that point. If you go to up 113th Street, another monument, this one to Louis Kossuth, great hero of the 1848 Hungarian Revolution. I love the couple at the base of the statue that are described as a revolutionary soldier liberating an aged peasant from poverty and oppression. It's a great image. Well, at 110th Street, we arrived, of course, at Morningside Heights, the first of a series of distinct high points that rise over the river in northern Manhattan. Morningside Heights developed in the early 20th century as a kind of acropolis. It was seen as a place for major memorials like Grant's tomb, for great institutions of learning like Columbia University, and for great religious organizations such as Riverside Church or the Cathedral, St. John. The idea was that this was going to be, as I say, an acropolis, New York's center of learning and prestige. The vision to make this happen was spurred on by Cornelius Vanderbilt, who in 1909 decided that Morningside Heights provided a great opportunity to create a memorial to Robert Fulton, who created the steamboat that led to New York's prosperity, and also to Henry Hudson, who, after all, discovered, as they say. So this is the plan for a monument that would be built between 114th and 116th Street on the slope of Riverside Park, leading up to the Columbia campus. That would be the ceremonial entryway to Manhattan. If you were a guest visitor or a dignitary, you would arrive here, to banqueting spaces, to a museum about Fulton, to great ceremonial spaces. Now, this, of course, never happened. But Vanderbilt's other great project, the Hudson-Fulton celebration, did. This was a plan in which the 300th anniversary of the arrival of Henry Hudson was celebrated, along with the creation of the Claremont. It was a huge undertaking. 18 days commemoration, one of the largest public events in the city's history. It featured parades downtown, concerts, a military parade on the Hudson, between 800 boats, and a 33-minute flight up the river by Wilbur Wright in one of his new airplanes. To me, the highlight, however, was when 1 million people watched from Riverside Park as replicas of Henry Hudson's ship, the Half Moon and the Claremont, drove into each other and collided mid-river. This is a great picture there of the Claremont taking part in that Hudson-Fulton celebration. And you'll notice up on the hill behind it is the Henry Hudson apartment house looking in. Quite splendid.
Bill?
Now, yes.
Excuse me, but we now that we're out of Bloomingdale, we're running quite a bit over time. So
Yes,
I think it would be a great idea to wrap up and give people a chance to ask some questions.
Okay, well, let me then say that there is more in Manhattan to go, all the way up to Spuyten Duyvil, and I've encouraged people absolutely to do that, to continue the walk and discover for themselves the things that lie farther to the north. But I will stop then and say, well, we can certainly try for questions that people would like to ask.
Michael, do we have anything coming in?
Yes, thank you, Bill. So I'll start with the first question. This is regarding towards the Holland Tunnel. You mentioned that there were a few attempts to get it built, and one of the questions why, do you know why some of the initial attempts failed?
Yeah, the tunnel was an enormously ambitious one. There'd been railway tunnels punched under the river under both the East River and under the Hudson for the Pennsylvania Railroad. But building a vehicular tunnel in two tubes was a much more complicated business. They needed to solve the problem of ventilation, particularly how to get the fumes from gasoline engines out of the tunnel. And that required those four large ventilating towers, two on the New Jersey side and two on the Hudson side. It was a bigger project than anything had been tried before. The diameter of the tunnel is easily twice that of the railway tunnels.
Got it. Can you tell us more about the U.S. Navy operating at West 96th Street?
No, I can't, as a matter of fact. I'm sorry to say.
Okay. The other question we also had here is, this is early on in the talk when you were talking about the trade that happened up and down the Hudson. Is there a small brief thing you can mention about the indigenous peoples trading, or if they had any commercial activity along the Hudson as well there?
Absolutely. It did not take the arrival of Europeans to make the Hudson a trading corridor. It was certainly used by the indigenous people for trading all manner of things from furs onwards. It was, in fact, that existing fur trade, I think, that people like Astor plugged into and took advantage of the network that had already been established along the river.
Thank you. And then if anyone would like to raise their hands, to ask your question directly. We will allow you to unmute yourself and ask that question. Or if you have any other questions, feel free to place them into the chat. And thank you about that building, the triangular building on 96th Street. I've always wondered why that decoration was up there. Oh, do you have any more information on the Westbeth?
Yes. So it began life as first the home of Western Electric, then Bell Telephone Laboratories were in there, and it continues today to be a home and studio for working artists. You can go to Westbeth. They have a gallery there. They have a little community events room in which they do lectures, programs, and concerts. They do exhibits by the residents, and it's a fascinating place to visit. You can walk into that central courtyard that Richard Meyer designed, which was inspired by a work by the Swiss architect Le Corbusier called the Unité d'Habitation, which was designed to be a living and working commune, much like the one that Westbeth is today.
Got it. Thank you. Alice, for questions about availability of the talk, yes, this will be available on our YouTube channel, but you can also follow our website at upperwestsidehistory.org, and we will have the link of the recording available tomorrow morning.
All right. So I think that is it. Bill, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And thank you to Michael as well, and to everyone in the audience for joining us today. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. And thank you, Bill.